Welcome back to this edition of Farm Fact Friday. Did you know that 1/3 of the world's food production relies on pollinators? Without these insects and animals pollinating our flowers and plants, we wouldn't have some of our favorite foods like avocados or chocolate. So this week we will focus on pollination and its importance in our food sources and our ecosystems.
Pollination is the transfer of pollen from one flower to another. Pollination is an important role in the life cycle of all flowering plants and is vital for the reproduction of flowers and seeds. Now, there are a few different ways pollination can occur. One way pollen can be carried and transferred is by the wind or water. And sometimes flowers can self-pollinate, meaning they do the work all on their own. But the number one source of pollination is through insects, birds, and mammals, like butterflies, hummingbirds, bats, and bees. And these guys are the ones responsible for 90% of the world's flowering plants. Talk about some busy bees. So how exactly do these hard-working creatures pollinate flowers? Well, let's take a honeybee for an example. The honeybee is in search for flowers because they like to drink the sugary sweet nectar that the flowers make. When they land on a flower, the pollen from that flower sticks to their bodies. As they fly over to the next flower to find more nectar, they will drop some of the pollen from flower number 1 onto the second flower. They may even pick up new pollen from the second flower as they fly to a third flower. So here's a video of a bee at Farm Lab. If you look closely, you can see the pollen sticking to its legs and abdomen. We are so lucky to have our hard-working bees here at the farm. Now I'm going to turn it over to Farmer Catherine so she can discuss how essential pollination is on the farm.
Here on the farm, pollinators are really important. Without pollinators, we don't have food. You can see really clearly here we have our apple flowers, and they're turning into little tiny baby apples down here. And then you can really start to see the apples form on our apple tree. Oftentimes, on big farms where there's a lot of apple trees or peach trees, they actually have to bring in colonies of honeybees to pollinate their trees. It's really important for them then that they're not spraying any pesticides or their neighbors aren't spraying any pesticides at those times that those bees are coming in. Bees are tiny little creatures and they're very susceptible to any imbalance in their environment. So we want to be really cautious as environmental stewards and as people to make sure that we're putting the right things on our plants. And there's a lot of alternatives to keeping our plants safe other than chemicals, such as building our soil, ensuring we're growing plants in the right season, and finding alternatives to find other creatures to help balance our ecosystem.
Farmer Catherine just pointed out that the flowers on the apple tree turn into apples. This can only be done with pollination. So let's look at this pollination cycle of an apple tree. Number 1 shows a flower full of pollen. In step 2, the bee takes the pollen from flower number 1 and lands on the new flower on the apple tree that you see in step 3, leaving behind some of the pollen from the first flower. That flower is now pollinated and will grow to be an apple that you see in steps 4 and 5 of this cycle. That apple will then produce seeds, which will be planted as seen in step 7, which will allow new apple trees to grow. As they begin to grow, they will produce flowers like you see in step 8. And yep, you guessed it, the pollination cycle starts all over again. Without our pollinators, we would not have our favorite foods. Farmer Catherine is now going to discuss a problem that our honeybees are facing.
You may have heard of the term colony collapse. This is where honeybees colonies mysteriously just all die. It's been happening a lot, and scientists are working to see what's contributing to this. There's a lot of causes and it's really complicated, but what we do know is that honeybees are an indicator species. So honeybees are so small that they are very susceptible, as we said, to different environmental impacts. And so we know when the honeybees are suffering, all of the insects and all of our pollinators are also suffering. So it's a complicated issue, but we can start at the basics and we can say, hey, how are we showing up for our plants and our environment? Are we spraying any chemicals? Are we encouraging pollinators to come by having flowers? Are we keeping habitat around so that there's a good diversity? So, honeybee collapse is something that we should be concerned about, but we can also take responsibility in our own yards and our own communities by planting a lot of habitat for all of our pollinator friends.
Here to close us off this week are more honeybees enjoying the flowers here at Farm Lab. Our extension activities this week will encourage you to dive deeper into pollination and find new practices for you to implement in your own life to help protect our pollinators.